Okay, this game is called Andromedum, and it's kind of a little bit of a tricky thing they do with the picture here. Huh, wonder how they did that. That's actually just 2D on my desktop, which I mean I know it is, but it's usually like squished. But it's actually full screen. It's a 360 degree, I guess that's why. Huh, nice. So this is basically a story that you're following. So let's see. Reset position. Release and grab. Book. Select.
Chapter 1. I'll make it, Jack told himself, the way he'd said it 100 times now. If I keep going, I'll make it through. He needed to believe that, even though there was a good chance it wasn't the truth, even though he couldn't remember why it was so important anymore. The long run across the vast swaths of fields around him was about more than just endurance. It was about tricking himself, chopping the distance into smaller pieces, about making it to the end of the row of wheat, then to the fence, then to the next. It was a trick he'd learned. But no, there were some things he couldn't trick his way around, and the vast empty spaces of his memory were one of them. They sat as huge and open as the fields around him, hints of the past peeking through now and then, like the ruined buildings that had dotted the way ever since the capital city. Memories retreated like waves when he reached for them, though, impossible to grasp, impossible to even keep up with, too much hidden in their depths. There were so few things that Jack knew. He knew that he had to run. He knew that hunters would be following the same way they had been following ever since he had woken up in a cave full of bodies back in the city. Jack had crawled out of that, clutching the short, stabbing sword he now held like a talisman. And it might not even be mine, Jack said to the air around him. The sword was standard enough, a leaf-shaped blade as long as a man's forearm, with a leather-wrapped hilt. Military issue, according to one of the corners of his mind that refused to give more when Jack turned his attention to it. The scabbard was more elaborate. It was red-stained leather, worked with spiral patterns in what looked like silver. Jack had clutched it to him as he'd risen from the grave they'd tried to put him in. He'd kept it with him even though it was probably the thing that most marked him as different. He treated it like it was special, his. But what if it wasn't? What if it was really the property of some other poor soul from the cave? There had been plenty enough of those, after all. What if he was clutching some other man's favorite weapon, some fragment of another man's past that had nothing to do with him? Jack laughed a cracked, broken laugh at that before realizing that he needed the breath to run instead. "Keep going," Jack repeated once again. "Don't stop until you reach the border. It will be safe across the border." The words were a certainty, made from stone as they sat at the heart of him. He probably sounded insane talking to himself as he ran through an empty field. Perhaps he was insane. But there was no one else there to use for encouragement. There had been people here once. The burnt-out buildings stood in testament to that. Some of them hadn't been finished before they'd been destroyed. Now, though, there was just Jack and the farmland and the surrounding mountains. Even the birds were silent today. The absence of their call turned the day to a tight stillness. Jack had vague memories of bird calls, something about seagulls cawing as they circled around a ship. No, below a ship. And that made no sense at all. What was the point of memories when he couldn't trust them, when they betrayed him as surely as anyone else he met out there would? A horse would make this a lot easier, Jack said, as much to break the silence as because the thought made sense. Where was he likely to get a horse? Jack shivered slightly as he ran, the sweat from his running cooling quicker now, and one glance at the sun said that night would be coming soon enough. He needed to find shelter before then, real shelter, not just some burnt-out husk of a place where he'd be as likely to be crushed by falling timbers as Sleepwell. If he could make it to one of the mountains, there might be caves, but Jack knew that mountains had a habit of being further than they looked. Again, it was impossible to know how he knew it. Maybe it was simply something everyone knew. There were things he did know, All the things that normal people needed to live in the world were still there, laid out as neatly as books upon a shelf. It was just that some things, like the reasons why it was amusing to think about whole shelves of books, eluded him, retreating into the dark corners of his brain. He knew enough to know the world he ran through, its coins and its people. He knew enough to run every time he'd seen guards in royal colors, red and black, compared to the dull gray of the peasant clothes he'd stolen from a line somewhere back in the city. Jack ran on, past one of the old iron monsters sticking up from the fields. There were places, he'd heard, where these stood all in a row, wires connecting to one another like prisoners chained together. This one stood solitary, and Jack stared up at the metal framework stretching so far into the sky. No, he couldn't believe that was true. The royalty of his own time ordered their monuments built out of stone, not caring how many people died building them. How powerful must the kings and queens of the old times have been to raise this thing of iron and steel? A whole string of them forming lines across the land for no reason Jack could see was too much to contemplate. The old civilization of the ancients might have done some strange things, but that would have just been insane. Not as insane as still being outside at night, Jack muttered, and kept running. He needed shelter. He was still at least a week away from the border. He knew that with a certainty that he didn't know anything about himself. That meant more nights out in the wild, just himself, with little in the way of supplies. He had no water left in his water skin. He had the sword, of course, and so far that had been enough to keep away predators of both the animal and human varieties, but the rest of what he owned was ragged now. Jack smiled grimly at that. At least I fit in. That was true. Away from the capital, the folk who worked the land were as ragged as he was, grubby with work and usually suspicious of strangers. It was a world where those in charge took what they wanted from those who worked the land. At least once on his run, groups of villagers had driven him off with shouts and thrown stones. Some nagging part of Jack said that they ought to be running from him, not the other way around. Yet, from a distance, Jack looked like one of them. Only the sword that may not even be his sword, gave him away, and half of those he met assumed he had stolen it anyway. He hadn't tried to explain what had really happened. It would have only invited trouble for him. And when had the truth ever made a difference in this world, anyway? Jack stopped, resting on his hands and knees for a moment. The sun was closer to the horizon now, and the darkness would soon be following in its wake. Hunger gnawed at Jack, but he ignored it. He was stronger than that. Not much stronger, but stronger nonetheless. There wasn't anything to hunt here, and he still hadn't covered enough ground. He wouldn't have covered enough until he finally made it across the border a week from now. It wasn't safety, but it was as close as he was going to get with everything that was following him. Jack rose to press on, but then stopped as he saw one thing that he hadn't been expecting: an intact farm. Where the others were burnt down, this stood complete and untouched. It was a little ramshackle, with one shutter hanging off its window frame, the slow-turning windmill above rickety in its construction, but it was there, and it looked too good to ignore, especially since there was smoke rising from the chimney. Jack hadn't thought there would be a working farm here. The capital stretched out its arms, but those outside its reach were prey to whoever came along. There were enough bandits and thieves in the world that a place like this shouldn't have lasted long alone, even though it technically sat within the boundaries of the kingdom. Yet here it was. The smell of smoked meat came to him on the breeze, and Jack felt his mouth watering. Was this an oasis, or simply the next part of what he had to do? He'd been running automatically, without a plan or even a real thought. But perhaps this was about more than that. At the very least, it was too good an opportunity to pass up. Jack started to make his way toward the farm. "Hello there," he called as he came closer. "Is anybody home?" The fire said that there was, but it was better to call out. Better to approach openly rather than risk looking like he was trying to sneak in to steal from the place. If it had survived out here with nothing around it, presumably those within were capable of protecting themselves. Either that, or they'd been lucky in a way that people didn't have a right to be. "Says the man who crawled out of a cave full of the dead," Jack muttered to himself as he got closer. He'd held the sword by the scabbard in his left hand, well away from his body. It was better to let anyone within see that he had it. Let them see that he could protect himself, but that he wasn't trying to hide anything. When the door swung open, he wasn't expecting the combination of people who stood there. In a place like this, he'd been expecting strong young men used to the back-breaking work of the farm, certainly coming out first when there was a man like him approaching. Instead, an old man and a younger woman came out onto the porch of the house. The man had probably been strong once. In his youth, he might even have been in the Royal Army, judging by the way he held himself, but age had chipped away at him, shrinking his skin around his muscles while adding folds and lines around his face. His beard was broad enough that it was hard to get much of a sense of the man beneath, but his eyes there were intelligent, darting this way and that as they took everything in, obviously checking for an ambush. Although how Jack knew what that looked like was anyone's guess. The woman's eyes were hostile, which was a problem given that she was holding a loaded crossbow, the bolt unwavering as she pointed it straight at Jack. She looked like she was only looking for an excuse to pull the trigger, and worse, she looked nervous. An angry person might have shot Jack eventually. A nervous person might do it by accident. Jack knew that his best option was to talk, and talk quickly. "I'm not here for trouble. Then maybe you should move on," the woman said. Her voice would have sounded pretty but for the hard edge to it, as she continued to keep the crossbow trained on Jack. "Dahlia," the old man said, "that's no way to talk to someone." "I'm just here looking for food and shelter," Jack said. "I don't know what you're doing out here, but I'd be a fool to think I could try anything stupid." "Yes," the woman Dahlia agreed, "you would." "Dahlia," the old man repeated with a warning note in his voice. He turned to Jack, stepping between him and the crossbow. "You look like you've come a long way. I'm Henry, and this is my daughter, Dahlia." Jack said, because he didn't have any more than that to give him. "Just Jack?" Dahlia said. She'd moved around her father now. The crossbow wasn't pointing at Jack anymore, but it was obvious that she could bring it right back up again if she needed to. Jack shrugged. "That's all I remember." "And your sword?" Henry asked. All Jack could do was shrug again. "It's just a sword. I'm really just here for food and shelter. And a horse, if you have one to spare. I need to get to the border as quickly as possible." "Oh, is that all you—" Dahlia began, but Henry raised his hand to stop her. "You'd best come inside then, Jack, and have something to eat," Henry said. He walked back inside as though there was nothing further to say on the matter. Dahlia watched him go in with obvious incredulity, but she followed a second later. The door sat open in front of Jack, the invitation clear. He made his way towards it, and as he did so, he found himself wondering what kind of man he was. There were men in this world, he knew, who would take advantage of an offer like this, who, once they were close enough to knock the crossbow from the woman's hands, would take what they wanted from her and the farm, who would probably kill both her and her father, leaving nothing in their wake but blood, emptiness, and one more burnt-out farm. Even thinking that disgusted Jack. What kind of man was he that he could think about something like that as if it were obvious? But then it was obvious, because that was the world they occupied. Just as it was obvious that he was disgusted by it, and he wasn't going to do anything there but eat. "At least I know that much about myself," Jack said. It wasn't much of a start, but it was something. He stepped into the house. It wasn't in much better repair on the inside than the outside. It had the look of a place that had once been loved, and all of the furniture looked like it had been made by hand, probably a long time ago.
Sorry about that.
A large table dominated the room, sitting in front of a fire which a pot sat bubbling. Dahlia put a bowl of thick brown stew down on the table with bad grace. Her father sat at the table opposite that spot, while Dahlia moved away a little. Still close enough to listen in, though, Jack noted. "Sit," Henry said. "Eat." Jack didn't need a second invitation, sitting and picking up the wooden spoon that went with the stew. A vague memory flickered inside him, a flash of silver. No, holding something silver. He'd been sitting somewhere, a silver spoon in his hand, eating. No, it was gone again. And as quickly as it had come.
A little tough to get to the.
I've seen that look in the
Uh...
mirror?
Can't get the about.
Henry said.
Mm. Anyway, so this is Andromedum. Pretty cool if you like stories read to you and look at some pictures. I guess, if you were had a couch to lie down on, it's a little dizzying because you're floating in the air. They should have had it so you're sitting on the floor or standing in the field. So it's better to just kind of like fixate on one spot and don't look down very much. So I'm sitting down right now. So anyway, thanks for watching. Again, Andromedum. Andromedum. Yeah.